Wanda ma'am, Selena is not joining or what? She had wished to join.
Hi, Prashant.
Selena will not join or what? She had told me she will join.
Oh, Selena?
Selena Kumar, Selena.
Yes, yeah, she said that she'd be registering.
Okay. Alex sir,
Yes,
can
sir.
you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Sir, Sabsachi sir join করলে বলবেন।
Okay.
জয়েন করে গেছেন? আচ্ছা আচ্ছা। ভাইস প্রিন্সিপাল স্যার এখন জয়েন করবেন।
স্যার জয়েন করে গেছেন?
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, ভাইস প্রিন্সিপাল স্যারকে জয়েন করতে দিন।
স্যার জয়েন করে গেছেন?
ওকে ওকে। রেডি স্যার? রেডি স্যার আছেন? আলেক্স স্যার রেডি স্যার আছেন?
হ্যাঁ বলো।
স্যার শুরু করবো?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ শুরু করে দাও স্যার জয়েন
ঠিক
করেছেন
আছে।
রাইট
হ্যাঁ স্যার
তাহলে
ভাইস প্রিন্সিপাল জয়েন করে গেছেন। ওকে
ঠিক আছে শুরু করে দাও
ওকে we are going to start the program. First of all, good morning everyone, and good evening to our friends from Canada. I, on behalf of the Department of Political Science, Bidhan Chandra College, warm-heartedly welcome you all to this international webinar entitled Building Leadership Capacities. This international webinar has been organized by the Department of Political Science in collaboration with the Placement Cell and Internal Quality Assurance Cell IQAC, Bidhan Chandra College. We have got Sri Sabyasachi Raman Mishra, IPS, and Dr. Wanda Cross as the distinguished resource person for this today's international webinar. Sri Sabyasachi Raman Mishra, IPS, who is the distinguished chair for this today's international webinar. Dr. Sabyasachi Raman Mishra sir is a Deputy Inspector General of Police, Counterinsurgency Force, Government of West Bengal, India. Dr. Wanda Cross, who is the distinguished speaker for today's international webinar, is a program head, Global Leadership Studies, School of Leadership Studies, and associate professor at the Royal Roads University, British Columbia, Canada. He has a PhD in political science at the University of Exeter, United Kingdom. He is an award-winning author and has written, contributed to and edited 5 books and numerous books, chapters, and journal articles. He has contributed to the development of 4 centers and academic programs, 3 in the Middle East and 1 in Canada. She consults and presents internationally, focusing her work on integral approaches to leadership, civil society development, gender issues, and political change. May I now request our Vice Principal, sir, our head of the institution, Dr. Ramesh Kar, sir, to deliver a formal welcome address. Sir, now it's over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Respected distinguished research person, honorable dignitaries, dear colleague, research scholar, program coordinators, convener, IQAC coordinator, NEC coordinator, head of the department, and affectionate student. It is really a great pleasure and privilege to be present in the international webinar organized by the Department of Political Science in collaboration with IQAC and Placement Cell. Being the head of the institute, I must congratulate the department of the teachers of the Department of Political Science, especially HOD Professor Devdas De and convener Professor Prashan Kumar Sharma, as they have taken initiative to organize the international webinar. First of all, I, on behalf of the Institute, must welcome respected research person, Sri Sabyasachi Raman Mishra, IPS, Deputy Inspector of General of Police, Counterinsurgency Force, Government of West Bengal, and Dr. Wanda Cross, Program Head, School of Leadership Studies, Royal Road University, British Columbia, Canada. I would be immensely grateful as they have responded to our invitation despite their busy schedule. I convey my best wishes to our governing body president and all governing body members for moral support to organize the international webinar. I do hope that our participant would reap a sound harvest from the day's discussion. I firmly believe that the day's discussion will be interesting and interactive one. The survey of the day's speech and reciprocal discussion, I do hope, would further illumine the minds of the teachers and taught. I wish a warm success of the day's webinar. Once again, thanking you all.
Thank you so much, sir, for the welcome address. Your never-ending support and encouragement keeps us going with all these arrangements. So thank you so much, sir. May I now request Sri Sabyasachi Raman Mishra, sir, IPS, Deputy Inspector General of Police, Content Intelligence Report, Government of West Bengal, India, to kindly chair the session. Sir, now it's over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening, Dr. Wanda, for joining this international webinar. I understand, while the the IST timings let us begin our work. This is kind of winding up time for you over there in Canada. I'm quite happy, and it's a singular privilege for me to be part of this webinar, especially as it deals with the questions of leadership in these normal or the new times as we see today. Leadership concept has been an old one. It's a very ancient concept that has been discussed, debated, and there have been scholarly works on this, beginning from the concept of a protectionist kind of leadership that exists in the animal world, to the concepts of leadership which have been mainly dealing with the notions of transformative and the formation of social cultural world and the individuals as well. So it has been a long-ending debate, and I'm happy that this Viran Chandra College has taken this initiative of organizing this webinar, where the young minds and of course all of us will have the privilege of listening to your presentation on the question of leadership and how what are the challenges and what are the new notions which have come up in the recent world. I'm very happy to be, as part of the force that I belong to. We largely believe in an authoritative kind of leadership where, we are both the parents as well as the disciplining mothers to our men. So ours is a different world, but in these turbulent times, as we see, we have leaders, but the leadership is lacking. And this is a global phenomenon. This has nothing to do with one particular country. So I'm quite happy, and I will feel enlightened to listen to your presentation on the question of capacity building for the leadership and all the young minds that who are participating in this webinar. I hope they will be benefited by your presentation. May I request you to kindly start your presentation, please?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Mr. Sachi. Thank you, Prashant, for welcoming me. And it's my absolute pleasure to join you. I know it's morning time in India. It's nighttime here, so quite a vast difference in time zones. But I have been to India a couple times. I've been to Calcutta, in fact, a couple of times. So unfortunately, it's virtual, but this gives us the ability to connect nonetheless. Now, I'd like to share some slides, and I have to just ask for your patience. I'm not familiar with this platform. So if you could, Prashant, give me a little bit of guidance on how to share my screen, perhaps, and show my slides that I prepared.
Yes, ma'am. Khalik sir, can you speak to ma'am? Khalik sir, can you hear me?
So what I'll do is I'll try
Yes. So you can click on the present now button in the middle of the screen.
Okay, can you see my screen right now?
Madam, for that too, you have to minimize that.
One moment.
And then we can share your screen. Okay, we can share your slides.
You can see my. Okay, great. Can you see these slides now?
No, ma'am, it's not visible. Have you minimized that? First you have to minimize this screen, then you have to show the slide, then you are presenting the screen.
Okay, so one moment, let me try that. Let me try one more time. Okay, is it working now?
Khalik sir, can you
No, madam.
present the slide on her behalf?
Okay, I will share.
Okay.
Ma'am, Khalik sir will be sharing your slides, okay, and you will speak, and we will be presenting that.
Thank you, appreciate that.
All right.
So while you're uploading the slide, I'll begin nonetheless. So as you've mentioned my background a little bit, my interest is very much in politics in relation to how to create change, how to essentially use leadership capacities to create positive change. Thank you. Great, we have the slides up. So welcome to my presentation on building leadership capacities. So in this presentation, if you can move to the next slide, I'll first begin with an acknowledgement of where I'm situated in Canada. And I'm not sure if you're watching the news in Canada, but we've had very sad news over the past couple of weeks with the discovery of children who were in residential schools and were buried. So this has shattered many communities across the nation, and I know this has made global news. So it's brought greater awareness to the lands upon which we speak, on which we work, and obviously also enjoy and play. So giving my acknowledgement of where I'm located, and that's on Wasanich traditional family lands. These are the indigenous families and peoples who have been here for thousands of years, as well as the Capacities and Lekwungen families who are in the region around the city in which I'm located, which is Victoria, BC, Canada. So that's how we begin all our presentations here. Thank you for that. And this picture is here of the university in which I'm located. And thank you for the introduction, so we can just skip this slide as well. Thanks. And next slide, please. So what I'd love to do today is, after a brief introduction on leadership capacity and some of the challenges that you've spoken to, Sabia, you spoke to some turbulent times that are global and also those that are local. So every nation is dealing with critical times and things that are affecting different nations all at the same time. Who would have known that we would be in COVID times, for example? And so after introducing what leadership capacity is, I would love to introduce a change framework that I apply to a lot of my work and also teach. It's called an integral change framework. And with this, I'll offer a template that attendees will be able to understand and apply in their lives, and for addressing whatever issues that are dear to their heart. And so to get you to think a little bit about how you can do that, how you can create capacity, I'll also leave you with some guiding questions. So I'll take you step by step. And if we have time, I'll present a case study. I've done my research around the world, mostly in the Middle East, where I've looked at gender issues and in specific women's participation in civil society to understand their impact on creating change, more specifically political change, so creating that macro level, state level change. And so then we'll end with the question that I hope to hear from some of you, answers around how will you start? So I'll give you the template. And so then using that, how will you start to build leadership capacity into your life, your relationships, work, and activism as catalysts for change? And so I'm looking forward to that engaging discussion at the end. Next, please. So how we capture some of our leadership challenges, as we call them, is in many different ways. So we know that the top global leadership challenges or issues affecting us globally really are around food security, access to water, so water scarcity, hunger, poverty, unequal relations, gender issues, and obviously peace. That's one of the governing issues in our times. So the Sustainable Development Goals developed by the United Nations are goals around 17 different areas that help guide us with recommendations on how we can action change. And so these are one way of looking at global challenges. And as I mentioned, there are different ways. So just to keep in mind some of the things that we're addressing together and how we can create capacities to address these issues. Next, please. And so as you had mentioned in the introduction, we're facing issues of not just massive macro level global scales, but issues that are related to complexity, meaning that even though they are becoming bigger, they're also becoming more complex. And what that requires when they become more complex is leadership capacity to address them. That requires a number of different capacities that we didn't quite have thought we would need before, such as even greater adaptability or even greater resilience. And so can we think systematically and fashion policies in order to address these accordingly? Can we move fast enough? Because some of these issues, such as climate action, are so urgent that we need to be acting much more quickly than we are currently. So can we move fast enough to avoid economic decline? Economic decline is happening after COVID, definitely. Climate is happening in congruence to economic issues and will actually be the biggest issue, I believe, coming. And so can we avoid economic decline and collapse? Can we change direction before we go over the edge? And I'm reading from a book by Lester Brown called World on the Edge. Next, please. And I have in bold and red, yes. That's my belief. Some will differ. I'm sure many of you would debate this, but I believe, yes, not necessarily yes, that we can address all these challenges absolutely successfully. That's what I would not put forward, but rather that we have a moral obligation to do what we can, no matter what, no matter how far we've gone. This is a picture of an Inukshuk. That's essentially a carving or rocks put together by our indigenous Inuit people of the North, which is it's developed to create direction. And so we can create direction. We can forge pathways forward together. And if we don't change direction, we're likely to end up exactly where we're headed. Next slide, please. But what that requires of us is actually a couple of things. One is personal change. We can't lead, we can't become leaders until we become leaders of ourselves. And what that requires, number one, is changing our habits, changing the things that keep us back, keep us stuck, Personal change happens on a number of levels, and we'll go through that in a moment. And the second is awareness-based collective action. So in other words, working together. We can't address massive global issues if we're not working together. But if you look at this graph, where we are located right now, however, is at the bottom for many of us. We are reactive. Something happens in the world, we react right away. And when we are reactive, we're not actually using our capacities. Leadership capacities are located in the quadrant above, where we are generative, where we use our power. And remember, power, as I understand most people on the call are with a background in political science, is about the capacity to generate change, to influence change, and to have an impact. And so we want to move upwards with generating power. If we continue to operate within personal rage or to act reactively, as a collective, we won't be successful. Next slide, please. So personal capacities are what's absolutely needed, the ability to lead ourselves first, and also to lead ourselves with a systems view, to be thinking along sustainability goals, as I mentioned earlier with the 17 UN SDGs. So to create change, we must be thinking along transformation. How can we, not in linear terms, it's not about going from A to B to C, it's about how we can create capacities that build on each other. Because the sum is greater than its parts. So how can we create those changes in a transformative way? And that's with fundamental systems-wide reorganization across a number of spheres. That includes environmental, technological, political, social, and economic. And so what I'll offer in a little while is a much clearer map. What I've spoken about so far is personal change, thinking about self and systems, so connecting that personal change to systems transformations. Next slide, please. So the piece of the puzzle is awareness-based collective action. And that really needs to start with capacity building. And that obviously starts with each one of you on a personal level. So that requires looking inward first before looking outward to lead change. And that's through personal change first. And that's the piece of the puzzle. Next slide, please. So when we move inward, what we're talking about is developing ourselves. It's not just moving inward and looking at what we can bring out to the world in terms of power within, but developing that power within, creating our capacities, whether that's through courage, through bravery, through deeper understanding of ourselves, by peeling back biases so that we can create more perspectives, greater perspectives, so that we can see issues and challenges from different angles. That requires development in its deepest meaning, which is also transformation of the self. It's not just transformation of our systems, it's transformation of ourselves in vertical development. And that's super key for personal change. Next slide. So to increase your leadership effectiveness, the ability to create change, the ability to have a positive outcome on any issue that matters to you, comes from creating those capacities. So some more of those examples include learning. we're here together to learn. So increasing that cognitive functioning. And there are levels. And I'll explain a little bit more in a bit what that means, but it's creating deeper and deeper cognitive functioning so that you can see more, so that you can be more, and increasing personal and interpersonal awareness. And what that is understanding yourself better and understanding how to relate to one another better. So creating a greater awareness of how to do that. And with challenges during our turbulent times, we're often, as I mentioned, reactive. We're often angry, we're in rage. But a big part of having effectiveness, leadership effectiveness, includes understanding our emotions better and understanding how to regulate our emotions, how to stay calm in the face of threat, how to stay calm when we feel challenged. And as I mentioned, it's not just personal or going inwards, it's interpersonal, how we can increase our empathy with others. These are what's called soft skills, and these have been in leadership learning undervalued up until now that we're addressing complex issues. Next slide. So what is leadership, if we're going to be talking about leadership capacities? Leadership is about distributing power in a way that contributes to change. Now, it doesn't have to be positive change. We've seen many examples in history where it wasn't positive change. In fact, leadership studies began with the study of Hitler. And so the learning there was trying to understand how a person can lead masses, influence masses, and it wasn't in any positive direction. So leadership on its own does not have to be positive, but what we want is greater ways of being, doing, and seeing. So different ways of being, different ways of doing things, and having those different perspectives in a way that's transformative, one that's generative. In other words, we're distributing power to generate better things, bigger things, and one that's empowering. And so it includes 4 things. Leadership should include leading ourselves first. And that's by learning, as I mentioned, and that's also by growing. B, it's leading with right action and right behavior. C, leading in relationships, so engaging with others so that together we can create change and shift our cultures. And D, transforming systems. And remember, that's political, economic, environmental, technological systems, the larger structures in which we as individuals are embedded. And then also exercising in multiple forms with a vision. So those are the 4 forms. So with these multiple forms and guided by a vision, or else you get lost. And so if we think about leadership capacities, what we're actually talking about is what facilitates the ability to create those changes. And I've listed here, as you can see on the slide, a number of capacities, and this is not an exhaustive list. There are many. The key ones for dealing with our turbulent times are adaptability, so the ability to shift perspectives, to change the ways we apply our skills. Now, skills are often technological. They're learned ways of doing things. They're tools. They're not necessarily capacities, but we need the capacity to use those skills in many different settings, so not just one. And so to adapt ourselves to functioning in a positive way, in a transformative and generative way, in different circumstances. A second very important capacity during our times is resilience, as I mentioned earlier. So resilience doesn't mean that you're simply strong in the face of challenges, Because if you're just simply strong in the face of challenges, you can break. So if you can imagine a branch that can bend, you're resilient in a way where you can adapt. So these two terms go together. You stay strong, you stay calm, and you're able to adapt at the same time. Personal awareness, compassion, perseverance. So the ability to keep going even when you don't see changes happening in front of you. And so if we get to the case study that I present, one of the biggest leadership capacities that the women that I studied in the Middle East as my main area of study demonstrated was perseverance. Oftentimes, and for years, they didn't see change happen, but they persevered. And sometimes change happens after years. Sometimes they're still not even seeing change. Sometimes, as you know, change hasn't happened and things are worse. It's really, really important to work with what are called feedback loops. So if you keep, at the same time that you're persevering, if you find that from your feedback loops, which are messages from within the system, paying attention to what results you're having, evaluating how far you've come, if you don't see much happening, well, then maybe it would be time to reevaluate. So adaptability means listening to the system, listening to those feedback loops, and seeing where next the energy needs to go to transform. And so, in other words, using your knowledge appropriately. Next slide, please. So, before I move on with the template, which is what I have in front, I think I'll just do a quick check-in and see if there might be just a few questions at this point. You're welcome to raise your hand, and then I'll hand it over to our chair to facilitate that piece.
Good morning, Prashant. Good morning, good evening, ma'am, and good evening. Good morning, sir. Prashant, can I raise a question at this point?
Yes, sir. With the permission of the chair, you can raise your questions.
Okay, Chairman, sir, can I raise a question?
Yes, please.
Oh, thank you, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Once again, you spoke of challenges, vision, and perception. So my question is that these challenges actually existed even before in the last decade. But now we seem to have some sort of a difference in the capacity of leadership with the past and the present. So do you think that the social conditions, the economic conditions, the political conditions are posing the challenges as far as the capacity, vision, and the perception of leadership quality of today is concerned?
Perhaps if you could rephrase your question just to make sure that I get it completely.
Okay. You spoke of challenges, vision, and perception just now. But these things, I mean, the challenges, they also existed in the last, I mean, in the before 2020s. But now I think, rather we think that there is some sort of qualitative changes in the leadership. So do you think that the challenges of, do you think the social conditions, economic conditions, or the political conditions of today, as well throughout the world, are posing some challenges to the capacity or qualities of the leadership of today, as far as the vision and perception is concerned?
I think Samir Wanda raised a very interesting question. He's talking of the burden of past and the new normal in which we are living now. So, because especially, in these COVID times, the challenges and the nature of problems have drastically changed, not only economically, politically, as well as socially. So he is asking for the, how to deal with this new normal situation. What are the challenges for the leadership? I believe, Samir, this is what you wanted to say.
Yeah,
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you for that question. There's a number of ways we can answer that question, and we'll probably answer it partially now and then come back to it after we look at the different ways to address, let's call it a crisis in leadership. So as we've seen in some countries, the leadership has changed or transformed very recently, but we have also examples where our leaders are not leading in a way that will get us to a successful place. And that's because in our times, we're dealing with challenges that are, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, are almost, it feels almost insurmountable. And so the crisis of leadership is there because it requires of our leaders to have greater capacities than they had 10 years ago. And so if leaders could really pay attention to what capacities are needed, and that those capacities are not just knowledge-based, but they are internal, they're moral, they're related to the capacity to stand within a moral sense and be guided by that vision in times of crisis and challenge, then I think we'd be in a better position. So that's one. Two, it's really important that our leaders pay attention to those feedback loops. And part of those feedback loops include us. It includes people. It includes everyday people who live their lives out in different capacities and have lots to say around what their needs are. So if our leaders are so disconnected that they're not listening to what's really happening on the ground and how the political situation is felt differently by different people, so we're not all in the same boat necessarily just because we're dealing with the same issues such as COVID or climate action. People are impacted differently. So if leaders are not paying attention to how these transformations and these changes are impacting people differently, then we're not going to be successful either. So there's a crisis because there needs to be an inward growth that's not necessarily happening among many leaders, and there has to be listening to what's going on with people. So they need to be listening to feedback loops that we provide as regular citizens. And their actions have to align with their vision. And oftentimes we see that their actions are not aligned. And yes, definitely, as you mentioned, our political challenges are becoming greater. And if leaders are not working with leaders globally, if they're working in isolation, they will also fail. So there's even greater urgency and need for leaders to be working together around the world. I hope I've answered your question, at least partially.
Thank you, ma'am. You have correctly hit the point. That's what we want to listen. Thank you so much.
Okay, were there questions in the chat? Okay, how can the world community be salvaged from the clutch of authoritative dictatorial leader? So I think I'll answer that question towards the end, because I think we're going to have a better idea of how to do that, and you'll be able to answer that question yourself. And then the next question, soft skills of leaders, do you think that maybe they're perceived as non-responsive or unaccountable? Yes, so in many places we see leaders, of course, who feel that they don't have to be accountable to people. So our ideal is that there's accountability in a way where, as I just mentioned, there's listening to those feedback loops, which includes us. So definitely, yes, unfortunately, we have leaders who are not responsive. And so our job, whatever level we are at, so whether we are in governance, so whether we're working within government, police, the university, social organizations, no matter what level you are actually in a leadership position, And so that's really, really important to understand that no matter what, you do have capacity to contribute to change. And that's why it's really important to understand what those capacities are. Okay, so I'll move on and we'll address the question that I had earlier. I think we lost our slides. There we are. So, hoping everyone can see the slides still. Can I get a thumbs up that everyone can still see the slides? Because I can only see a small picture of the slides.
Alex sir. Alex sir, can you see the slide?
Wait a minute.
So as we're bringing up the slides, what I'll mention is that an integral perspective is one that is holistic, one that offers us a four-pronged approach to addressing any leadership challenge. So whether it's at a macro level or a community level, so a more local level. And the slide that will jump up on your screen hopefully soon demonstrates four key areas. Number one, as we mentioned earlier, it's that personal level, so going inward and moving ourselves from being reactive to being generative. So for example, from rage to compassion, from having a closed mindset, so a very limited way of seeing the world or perceiving challenges even, to a growth mindset. So thinking always in terms of, well, what solutions are out there, and holding hope that there are solutions. So that's, if we look at four different areas, that's one area. The second area to this holistic framework, called the integral approach, is thinking about what actions we're taking. Sometimes we shouldn't be taking actions, actually. Sometimes we need to take a step back and observe what's going on before we jump in and make sure that our actions are aligned so that they're appropriate to the situation or the challenge. And within that quadrant, which is number two, thinking about what skills we need to address the challenge, what we can pull from our experience, what we can pull from our knowledge, what we need to grow in to do better, and how to move from authoritarianism to being inspirers. So that's action. The first one is going inward to look at how we can grow. Second one is action, or our behaviors. The third that you'll notice is in the lower left quadrant, relates to our collective self. So moving ourselves, because it's transforming ourselves, moving from me to we. So in essence, it's a we space, it's that collective. And in this space, this is where we change or shift our cultures. So how can we become more inclusive? How can we tolerate others in a better way? How can we work with teams in a way where we see equality and we include those in decision making? So that's number three, that's our collective. Number four is seeing those systems, seeing that macro level and understanding how to work with politics, how to work with economics. And a lot of our challenges are obviously not in one of those categories. They're political and economic, and often also technological and also environmental. So really having a good grasp of those macro level issues, because those macro level issues affect our behavior, affect to what degree we're what ability we have to act, and affect the cultures we have within our communities and our organizations. Next slide, please. And so we need to also be thinking in terms of power. So thinking back to that personal level, how can we create power from within ourselves as individuals? What can we pull from within ourselves to be more adaptable, stronger, to be in better states, and move to those soft skills such as compassion? Going to the upper right quadrant is generating power to, and that means the power to create change, the power to be transformative. How can we move our visions to actual action? How can we start aligning our action to our vision? Now, I'll talk a little bit about the acts of refusal to answer also further the earlier question on how to address change at the political levels. So it's not always taking action in the way that we think. And so I'll introduce the concept of refusal in a moment. And with the lower left quadrant, it's how can we create power together? How can we become stronger together? What are the things we need to learn and do to do so? So to be more inclusive, to shift values so that our values are higher values. Values that see equality, for example, or see justice, for example. How can we be more collaborative? And then with power 4, that's the lower right quadrant, if we keep in mind the 4 different areas, is how can we move from being dependent on others, dependent on leaders or those that we think are leaders? How can we lead our way to becoming more independent from them, more self-sufficient? But that's not the end, because that's not where we will actually be successful by being independent. Ultimately, though, we need to be independent ourselves before we can become interdependent and stronger together. Next slide. And so to think about those 4 areas, number 1, you really need to create capacities to be your greatest version of yourself on an individual level. That's how you begin developing leadership capacities. Next slide. And developing your action logics. And what are action logics? Those are the way we perceive the world, the way we see the world. So thinking about how we organize reality, because for all those who are with us in the room today, each of you see reality differently. Your goal then is to make meaning and reasoning in a way where you can see multiple different perspectives, because that's how you work best in teams. That's how you can work with others in a way that's successful. And so as you move up in ordering reality, you are thinking about your purpose of life. What needs we act on? What ends we are moving toward? And thinking more about the emotions that drive us, the experience of being, and seeing where our roles are and how we should place ourselves in the world. Next slide. So some questions to guide this capacity development on the personal level. These are some things that offer or can offer reflection. What are my biases? So where are my blinders? Why am I not seeing certain things that perhaps others can see? And how can I see them too? What are my beliefs around my own agency? And that's super important, because if you think you can't do something, well, then you're probably right. We know that saying. And what's uncomfortable about imagining a better future? So what about that better future is holding us back from actually moving forward and taking action? How might I describe my states? Because if we're in anger, if we're in rage because something has happened that's unjust, for example, it's going to be really hard to be coming and acting from a place of calm, of really being able to judge the situation correctly. So being able to check in and ask yourself, what is my state that I'm acting from right now? And shift that state if you need to. And always growing in our principles and ethics. Because we could have certain principles that are not actually conducive or aligned to the change that we need to see in the world. So what are those principles that we might need to change? What are those values that we might need to shift to be higher values? And what are my mindsets? Maybe I need to change my mindset. What's that paradigm that I'm looking at? Maybe there's different paradigms and different ways to look at a particular challenge, and so forth. Next slide, please. And number 2, what actions are needed for my capacities to grow? So for my capacities to grow, perhaps I need to learn something more. So what knowledge do I have now? Is it aligned to what needs to be changed? If not, what knowledge do I need to gain? Is there anything from my background, my own history, my family's history, that I can think back to and use for this current challenge? What skills do I have, and what skills do I still need to add to be able to address this challenge? Is my behavior aligned? Maybe it's not. And if it's not, what do I need to do to change my behavior? And is my current role allowing me to address this change? Or maybe I need to change my role. Maybe a different role will allow me to use the agency that I need to. Next slide, please. So I mentioned refusal earlier. Refusal is about being and doing and transforming power generatively. And it's a term that's been created by a number of scholars, number one being Carol McGranahan, where it's recognized especially as, coming back to the question that was asked earlier, where leaders are not being responsive, where they're not listening to citizens, how you can actually refuse the status quo or that powering over in a way where maybe it's not right or the best thing to do, for example, in authoritarian regimes, to be addressing that power straight on, that power over. And so there are different ways of generating change in order to create change. So it's, for example, an investment in hope, as I mentioned in the case study of where I've looked at women in the Middle East creating change. It's through hope and finding innovative ways to address challenges, not by necessarily going out and marching in the street, even though we did see the Arab Revolution or the Arab Spring in 2011, where people went to the street. But previous to that, that was almost unheard of in the Middle East. That was heard of perhaps in Latin America, but much less so in other regions in the world, where refusal sometimes is the best way to create change. And so it's not about erasing domination, because that thinking itself actually recreates domination. So when people think that they need to dominate those that are powering over, once they get to power, we often see in leaders that they do the same things that those that they despised had done before. So it's approaching leadership in a different way. Next slide, please. And so if we think about some of the questions that might guide the capacity to change the way we do things. So to do things differently, we might ask, for example, what actions towards meso, meaning the organizational level or the civil society level, what actions towards civil society or the macro level, so state level change, do I need to do or need to incorporate? So this could be different ways of being, so different beingness, doing things differently, and taking different perspectives. What knowing do I need? So what knowledge do I need to be able to act in a different and productive way? How can I bring my beingness into the world to create that change? And it doesn't always have to be focused on the macro level. If we're focusing on ourselves, if we're focusing on family, an organization that we're part of, if we're creating change in those spheres, there will be a ripple effect automatically. And so not to worry about always focusing on the macro level systems change. And so what can I do if we're getting feedback loops, and some are negative, which tells us that we're not on the right path, and some are positive? What can I do to reinforce those positive feedback loops? So what actions, what new actions can I take? This is a picture of here in BC. You can see how big these old growth trees are. These trees were actually being cut down by loggers. And so we had right here on the island where I'm located, we had people protesting, writing letters. So in other words, using refusal, so refusing the status quo of that situation. And very recently, just within the past few days, we got notice that there will actually be a pause for 2 years on cutting down these old growth trees. Now we're talking about trees that are 300-400 years old. And obviously that affects climate change. So this is really important. And it worked. So refusal can work when we think that we're up against big economic corporations. Next slide, please. And so thinking about that lower left quadrant, how can I move to a we space? And so there's a number of ways we can do that. One is being more inclusive. How can we be more inclusive of those who have been more marginalized? So whether that's gender marginalization, racial marginalization, those who are in a different educational level, there's many ways we can think about including others. How can we create greater participation of those who are on the fringes, those who are marginalized? How can we enhance cooperation? Really, really important is how can we create better trust? And trust starts with oneself. If you can't trust yourself, you're not going to be able to trust others. And then with trusting others, and how can you even trust things that are less tangible, such as the process of change? So there are many things here to think about and reflect on. I won't go into all of them. Next slide, please. But some of the questions that could guide your thinking is, for example, what perspectives are dominant within the cultures that I routinely traverse? So the cultures at my workplace, for example, and what new ways of being, doing, and seeing together, though, can we embrace? How are global leadership challenges currently addressed? Maybe they're not addressed in the way that they should be. So thinking collectively, how can you create different ways of addressing them? And what are the barriers to feeling that people are part of the collective? And what does trust mean to the collective? What are values that we're saying we want, and which do we actually see? Next slide, please. These are some of the questions to get your thinking going, to think about the capacities that you can create. And number 4, how can we see ourselves operating effectively in the larger global systems? And so to do that, then, how can, this is creating larger macro impactful level capacities, how can we think in terms of how to approach systems in a way where we're creating greater understanding of our economic systems, what economic systems could be shifted to be more inclusive? So, for example, capitalist to other forms. And then in that systems thinking about our political systems as well. What political systems can be more inclusive? Or in terms of leadership, what could be more distributive of power? So thinking holistically. Next slide, please. And some of the questions to get us to thinking about those capacities that we need are, well, where are the leverage points in the system? So there could be areas that are more easily workable or changeable than those in the system that we would first think about changing. So which are those? And what part of the system am I, or are we being called to change first or address first? And where can I build on from there? And in this area or this quadrant, this includes not just economics or politics or climate. It includes many macro level areas. So how we address things systematically, for example. Next slide, please. And so with my case study, what I did is study women in the Middle East to understand, and I did this for a couple of decades. So literally, I've spent most of my time abroad and mostly in the Middle East, so Europe, Asia, the Middle East. And what I studied was women within organizations. And why I did that was most Middle East women are depicted in the West as being passive. They're depicted as not being able to create their own empowerment or to create change. And so I wanted to see if that was actually the case. Whereas I knew, having spent time in the Middle East, that for many women, that was not the case. And I wanted to investigate. And so through many different activities, and I studied a multitude of different examples from women working within organizations at the state level, within networks, addressing trafficking of women, trafficking of children. What I observed and learned, and I actually participated with many of these groups of women, is that they were the ones that were actually leading change together with men. Sorry? So within these spheres in which they were operating, they actually created new laws. They actually created change laws. And they did that by working, and you can only do that by working within the 4 spheres. They didn't work in just one. So they worked at self-development. They worked by creating power to create change. They worked together in shifting understandings around what is right, what is wrong, what is oppression, what is gender balance. So shifting cultures and expanding civil society. And they perceived in creating a better situation, not just for themselves, but those they serve. So creating power for within their countries. So they demonstrate the very leadership capacities needed to get through these tough times and the complexities of our collective challenges. And the cover that I have right there is actually the cover of one of my books. So there's lots more. I can spend days talking about the different examples. So that's just briefly offering a review of what I've been able to observe. And so with all these questions that I've presented to guide you to think a little bit about how you might apply this template, what I'll read here is from Ervin Laszlo in his book, where he says, not only in nature, a dynamic system capable of rapid transformation, but humanity also is where we can create the butterfly effect. So changes that happen in ways that sometimes we don't even anticipate. When such a system nears the point where the existing structures and feedbacks can no longer maintain its integrity, it becomes ultra-sensitive and responds even to the smallest provocation for change. So don't think that little change that you're doing in your own organizations or families or personal lives or at university means nothing. Make meaning of it. It can create change, and you may not know exactly where it's going to create change. In this state, butterfly effects are possible. Such butterflies as the thinking, the values, the ethic, and the consciousness of a critical mass in society can trigger fundamental transformation. And next slide, thank you. So this leads then to discussion around if you could think about what is one thing you really want to have or see happen 1 year from now that requires leadership, what would that be for you? And so I actually am inviting you to think about one thing in your own personal lives or on a global level. What is that one thing that you'd want to see happen? And with the template that we've seen with the 4 different pieces or quadrants to the framework, what are the 4 areas of capacities that you can grow in? What would they be for you? And I hope and invite you to create a plan for yourself around creating what those skills might be, what those experiences might be, what experiences you can draw from. What is it within you you could transform? How you can work with others in a better way, how you could be perhaps more inclusive. And what you need to learn to understand how you're operating within those larger systems. And so next slide. These are some of the questions that could help you. How will you develop greater awareness? How can you reframe something negative to motivate yourself to take action? What biases do you hold that are holding you back? And so that's in the upper left quadrant, the perspectives area. In terms of behaviors, what perhaps might you stop doing? What's holding you back from taking action? And what actions might you need to start implementing daily to create better habits? In terms of culture, how will you engage others differently? Because you can always do better. How can you create space to include? And for the 4th area, if we're thinking about the environment and systems, how can you think globally? And how will you use a systems approach to create change? And so I'll leave those questions with you and then use the rest of our time together for questions and answers. So I'll hand it over to our facilitator to chair the session on questions and answers. So any questions, if you raise your hand, I'm happy to answer.
Very, very interesting presentation. Can we have questions from the participants?
Sir, I think one question is for you, sir. I think one question is for you. One professor has asked questions for the chair. So the question is, how can the world community be salvaged from the clutches of authoritative dictatorial leadership? Professor Pravir Kanti Basu has asked these questions from the chair. It's in the chat box.
And I'm going to have to ask you to repeat the question around authoritarianism so I get exactly where you want to go.
How can the world community can be salvaged from the clutches of authoritative dictatorial leadership?
Right. Okay. So to acknowledge that it's not an easy thing to do, obviously, and that it takes time. But as I mentioned with the case study that I very, very quickly went through, these are case studies of groups of mostly women that I studied in the Middle East, obviously under authoritarian regimes. And where I studied them were in Egypt, Qatar, and the UAE. And then also I went to other countries with the Middle East to study what women are doing to create change. And this is also over a couple of decades. So I got to spend sometimes 4 years to understand. And what I'd like to say with watching this period of time and going back again and again, so over 20 years, is seeing transformations created by small groups of people. So in the majority of examples, I saw 2 people start out, 3 women start out, maybe 5. And they just had an idea around, this is unjust. This situation is wrong. What can we do about it? And so therefore, thinking about the 4 areas, they may not have known the 4 different areas, but it was almost natural that they thought about the skills that they needed, what they needed to learn, how they needed to grow inwardly, what they needed to do together, and how to understand the system better. And in one example, when I first started working with an orphanage that was run by some women, they grew into 2. 10 years later, they were serving 10,000 people within, so this case study was in Egypt, 10,000. So from one organization to 10,000, and they didn't just have an orphanage, they had many facilities. And one of their activities was including university students in the orphanages. So the students would take the orphan, and they would also host classes in these orphanages for university students where they were learning about democracy. And they were learning properly about democracy and how to create change in their communities. So they had an effect on multiple different levels. And that's how you create change within authoritarian regimes. It's through the act of refusal, which I described earlier. It's not necessarily going out and marching. It's not necessarily trying to topple a regime. It's about being very innovative and creative and generative, so that those ripple effects happen within shifting cultures, because it's very difficult to change a leader at the top if the culture supports that leader at the top. So those cultures need to see a shift, a higher value system. So that's where the work needs to be done.
Dr. Wanda, we have a very interesting question from Zamina Parveen. She has indicated to a trend which we are seeing perceptibly in today's world, where the leaders of democratically elected governments are tending to behave like authoritarian leaders. And it appears that they are working more for their own ends than for the people in general. She wanted to know what can be the role of an ordinary person, a normal citizen, in shifting this behavioral pattern of the leadership. I believe, Zamina, I have put your question properly.
Okay.
Yes, sir, it's absolutely what I was asking. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah. So to give an answer is there's no one way. Number one, it has to be transformative. So we really have to stop thinking in linear terms that we move from A to B to C. It has to be cumulative in that we're coming with a holistic perspective. So if we're working together to create change, there comes a point where it's very hard to maintain superficiality. It's hard to maintain an unjust system when cultures, so to answer basically the question as earlier, when cultures within a state no longer tolerate such corruption or such authoritarianism. So again, it's not always addressing the state. That may be part of your action. That may be one approach. But if that's your only approach and it's not holistic, where you're looking at society and shifting that culture, even if you create that change, as you just said, even if you change the leader and put somebody in that is just, that person cannot operate within that larger system if underneath it the culture doesn't sustain it. So sustainability is extremely important. So sustainability through value systems that are anchored in society, so that when that person takes leadership, they are supported and they know that they are supported. And then they are held accountable as well. So the issue or the challenge right now is that those leaders are not held accountable. They're not answerable because the system doesn't require that they are. So it's extremely important that the system does hold them accountable, and that's through the culture. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. There is another observation from Samindra Mohan Biswas, where he talks that there is a crisis in the leadership, where the transformation from me to we is not happening, and this is really affecting the world. I think this again gels well with the question of Zamina, where the leadership is tending to be more authoritarian than democratic in today's world, and this is a general feeling that we see all across the globe today.
Yes, it's all across the globe. And so one thing that I mentioned earlier is, don't think that working at smaller levels of engagement don't impact larger examples of the collective. So if you're working with just one or two others in a network, my experience is that that network actually grows into a larger organization almost always, if that network is trying to address an issue that affects all. Not always. In some very authoritarian regimes, networks are actually the most optimal, and so they stay networks so that they're fluid and so that they can change and not be quashed like organizations can. But it's really important to think about what visions are guiding your organization, what values the organization houses. And so what many organizations do actually is an inventory to understand what those values are. If trust is missing, it's very difficult to be successful with many of the other values that people say that they have. So trust is probably one of the key ones to start with. Creating trust between individuals within an organization. Inclusiveness is another major value. And so that's why I've repeated inclusivity over and over. Those organizations that marginalize individuals or put some identities above other identities, whether that's gender identities or other identities. Those are the ones that isolate people and develop mistrust. So it's important to focus on the question of how can I be more inclusive in the organization if you're a leader? Even if you don't think you're a leader, you are, irregardless of positionality. So how can you, in any place that you're in now, imagine how you can be more inclusive of the person who is marginalized? So think about the person who's marginalized right now. How can you include them? Start tomorrow. And I know that everybody probably on the call is very inclusive, but how can you be even greater in inviting those that feel marginalized? How can you help them with the education and skills they need so that they can participate better, so that you have broader participation within the organization? It's not that everybody does the same thing, but so that everybody feels that they are wanted, needed, and that their contributions are meaningful and worthwhile. How can you give significance to each person within your organization? So in other words, how can you empower everybody within the organization to have a voice? And I know that everyone is in a position to be able to do that and start that, or to do better. So it's really important, and I'll come back again and again to that one quadrant in the lower left around culture. What are the values that are guiding that culture? Not all cultures are inclusive, are great, are loving, are compassionate cultures. So how can you create those kinds of cultures? How can you create an organization that's flatter in most situations? It may not be appropriate in all, but in most situations, how can you create it to be a little bit flatter than hierarchical? I hope that helps.
Thanks. Can we have more questions, please?
I think that there's no question.
So if there are no more questions, there's the one question that I've posed at the very end, which is, what is one thing you would love to see changed in 1 year? What is that one thing you'd love to have in 1 year? And what are the capacities that you need to create that change? And to use this template to create it. Thank you very much.
So if there are no questions, I think we should come to the end of this meeting. Thank you so much, Dr. Wanda, for a great presentation, I must say. I'm personally enlightened by the kind of concept that you have created. It actually shows an integral approach to development of certain traits in an individual, which can lead to some amount of capacity building, and that can lead to a lot of transformation in one's own personality. We started with the transformation of consciousness of an individual, where the thought pattern has to change, and then you emphasized on thinking about to be more. One must think that one is more than what, or one could be more than what one is at a given moment. And then, of course, this would lead to development of software skills and the changes in one's own personality, where you get over your own biases, which could be detrimental to the development of self as well as the society and the culture. You also talked about changes in one's own thought patterns, behavior changes, and how one must move towards a more inclusive, must have more inclusive approach to life and to the people. So there was a very, it was a holistic approach that you discussed, and I believe the participants must have been benefited by it. I'm reminded of a lecture by a great man when we were doing our training, where he told us that there is a leader in you, all of you. There is a leader in all of us, which is good. But what we need to do is to move from good to great. So this perceptual movement from feeling being good to being great is something that really takes one to a different level of consciousness, where one feels that one can be a game changer. One could be an inspirational individual where the change can happen. So it has been a very good presentation, and I believe it's going to be a pretty late night for you, Dr. Wanda, over there. And thank you so much for being with us. Participants must have been benefited by your presentation. May I hand over the mic now to Prashant for a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you so much, madam, for making us acquainted with your magnanimous and enthralling academic engagements about various conundrums and prospects concerning leadership capacity building. May I now invite Ms. Jamima Parveen to kindly deliver a formal vote of thanks. Jamima, it's over to you.
Thank you, sir. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks to all who have helped us in making this one-day international webinar such a resounding success. At the very outset, we would like to extend our profound thanks and gratitude to our Vice Principal, Sir Dr. Ramesh Kar, the head of the institution, for granting his permission and providing his perennial support and encouragement towards the successful conduct of this webinar. We express our heartiest thanks to Shri Sabyasachi Raman Mishra, Sir, Deputy Inspector General of Police, Counter-Insurgency Force, Government of West Bengal, India, for agreeing to chair this webinar entitled Building Leadership Capacity. Despite his hectic and tight administrative engagement at various governmental levels, sir, your auspicious participation as a chair has transmuted this occasion into a thought-provoking and vibrant academic event. Thank you so much, sir. We extend our heartiest thanks to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Wanda Cruz, ma'am, for accepting our invitation despite her busy schedule. Ma'am, we also thank you not only for sparing your precious time with us, but also for enlightening us with your widespread expertise about assorted aspects of leadership. We eagerly looking forward to have your further association with us so that we could get many more opportunities to hear your captivative ideas. Thank you so much. Now, we would like to thank the President of the governing body of our college, Dr. Sudipto Roy, sir, and all the members of the governing body for their constant moral support to our webinar. Our thanks also goes to Dr. Subhajit Bursar of our college, to Professor Madhushri Chatterjee, ma'am, coordinator of the placement cell, and to Professor Sadhunath Kundu, sir, coordinator of the internal quality assurance cell, for the continued moral support. We acknowledge the unwavering support and guidance received from Professor Devdas De, sir, head of the Department of Political Science. Thank you so much, sir. We would like to extend our sincere and heartiest thanks to Professor Prashant Kumar Sharma, sir, an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and convener, for taking up the initiative to organize this webinar. Thank you so much, sir. We would also like to thank Dr. Abdul Khalik, sir, an assistant professor at the Department of Physics, and Professor Unmesh Mondal, sir, an assistant professor at the Department of Computer Science, for performing their responsibilities as technical advisor in the best possible manner. Our vote of thanks also goes to Professor Deptanu Maji, sir, Professor Kamal Roy, sir, Professor Anandita Mitra, ma'am, all at the Department of Political Science, for their constant support in organizing this webinar. We extend our heartiest thanks to all the respected professors of all the departments and all the non-teaching staff of our college for their moral support. A special thanks goes to all the students of the Department of Political Science for enthusiastically coordinating and supporting the webinar, for showing further interest from the very beginning. Last but not the least, our sincere thanks goes to all the respected participants present here for their active participation and for making this event a huge success. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you so much, Jamima. I also acknowledge yours and Mr. M. Suresh Murthy's efforts in organizing this webinar. I once again thank you all for your active participation in this international webinar. We are hoping to see you all again. Have a wonderful time, and good night to our friends from Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to the board and everyone who's been involved and supporting this. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Take care. Have a nice day. Thank you so much, sir. Take care.
Bye-bye.